On this Wednesday night, sounding the alarm about overwhelmed pediatric hospitals.
We need to do everything possible to help our children. We're just not doing it.
The repeated calls for action and why the surge in patients could extend beyond the new year. Incoming whiteout, the storm that could affect millions of Canadians. Fighting the rising tide of hate in the U.S. Survivors of a mass shooting head to Washington in search of action. Plus, reporting for duty, the South Korean heartthrob trading in his microphone for a military uniform.
Global National with Donna Friesen.
Good evening and thanks for joining us. The holiday season is a chance for family get-togethers and social events, activities so many people crave after the last couple of years. But all that close contact means a surge of colds, flu, and COVID-19. Hospitals across the country, which routinely operate at 100% capacity, are now overwhelmed, and much of the concern is focused on facilities for children. Toronto's Sick Kids Hospital is one example. It's been operating at 127% capacity for several days in a row. It's not just the volume of patients, it's how sick they are that's so worrying. More than half the children in intensive care are on a ventilator, and resources are so stretched, non-urgent surgeries are being cancelled. Some doctors say children are paying the price for a crisis response that lacks urgency. Neetu Garcha has our top story tonight.
We wouldn't be in this crisis if this wasn't a follow-up to COVID, right?
In the early stages of the pandemic, the most vulnerable were the elderly. Dr. Sanjeev Gandhi says now the most vulnerable are children.
Kids are dying from this, and we just don't see that in a normal flu year or normal respiratory virus season. We're basically paying the price for pretending this pandemic was over before it was really over.
The pediatric cardiac surgeon says he's had to switch gears recently to support patients with respiratory illnesses. In response to 6 flu-related deaths in children in BC this season, the provincial government announced an influenza vaccine blitz and weekly reports on fatalities.
I don't want to be hearing about weekly deaths in kids. Like, if it's to that stage, like, we've lost the plot here.
I think it just shows you the extent of the crisis.
In Toronto, for the first time, Sick Kids Hospital is using a team of paramedics from across the region to shuttle patients to other hospitals to create space inside the packed pediatric ward.
Previously, this didn't really have to happen. Like, they would, spend their whole time there and then get discharged. So the fact that they're shuffling around like this shows that there's great stress on the system.
During a briefing about respiratory viruses on Wednesday, Quebec's top doctor urged people to avoid holiday parties if they have COVID-19.
We expect the COVID situation to get worse than it is right now.
A similar message from Canada's top doctor, who says all respiratory viruses, including variants of COVID and RSV, continue to burden the healthcare system. With hospitals across Canada already at capacity, it doesn't take much to force them above capacity.
The impact, particularly on children's hospitals, has already been overwhelming.
Back in BC, Dr. Gandhi is calling for stricter measures to help protect children, including easier access to vaccines, more testing in children so doctors like him know what they're treating, and
the elephant in the room is the masks. We have to have an indoor mask mandate. We need to do everything possible to help our children. We're just not doing it.
But when it comes to mandating that measure, health officials in BC and across the country remain reluctant. Neetu Garcha, Global News, West Vancouver, BC.
A nasty weather front is hitting parts of this country. It's connected to a huge storm in the United States that's stretching north from the Gulf Coast. At its peak, the system is expected to be more than 3,000 kilometers long. Right now, Manitoba and Saskatchewan are beginning to bear the brunt. With heavy snow and high winds forecast, conditions are deteriorating rapidly. Global News meteorologist Anthony Farnell is tracking this. Anthony, what are we in for?
Donna, next up, southern Ontario, eventually Quebec and Atlantic Canada. It'll be mostly snow for these locations. It's been snowing all day in southern Saskatchewan, Manitoba, northwestern Ontario. You can see the swirl, the center of the low up over the Dakotas, but the front, the cold front, extends all the way into the middle of the Gulf Coast. And it's on this southern end. There's a lot of energy, a lot of moisture and heat that's clashing with that colder air and creating ideal conditions for severe weather. A multi-day tornado outbreak continuing right now. That moisture, as it lifts north, it encounters some colder air, so it's more snow than anything, but there is the risk of freezing rain tomorrow morning for parts of southern Ontario. This low, not to be confused with this low. That's what's brought all sorts of inclement weather, snow and wind to Atlantic Canada as well. You'll see a 1-2 punch because this system, and one in the Midwest, is headed your way this weekend. So for Friday, there it is, still snowing in eastern Ontario into Quebec. Amounts will be significant. We are talking anywhere from 10 to as much as 20 or 30 centimeters. As far as Manitoba and Saskatchewan, this will be over multiple days, heading even into early Saturday morning. For Ontario and Quebec, most of it falls on Thursday, and then the system pushes east. Of course, there are warnings in place, and we'll be tracking it from the Weather Center. Donna?
Okay, we hope you will. Anthony Farnell in Toronto, thanks. The chair of Winnipeg's police board is apologizing for saying a search of a landfill for the remains of murdered Indigenous women is beyond police capability and that the families and advocates should lobby Ottawa to make it happen. In a statement, Councillor Markus Chambers says he sincerely apologizes for any harmful impact to a community still grieving. A 35-year-old man is charged with first-degree murder in the deaths of Mercedes Myron, Morgan Harris, and Rebecca Quantois, and a fourth woman. The remains of 3 of those women have yet to be found. Melissa Ridgen is following this in Winnipeg. Melissa, what's the reaction to what the police board chair said?
Well, Donna, that was met with disappointment and a bit of outrage from missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls advocates who say that if Winnipeg police feel they're not up to the task, the City of Winnipeg or the Manitoba government should be lobbying the federal government for support, not to put that responsibility on Indigenous people or families of murdered women. Advocates like the National Family and Survivors Circle and a growing number of chiefs across the country have now called on Ottawa to step in and fund a feasibility study for a search, fund the search itself, which could be in the double-digit millions, and all of this should be overseen by the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the rights of Indigenous people.
There's a 2-tier system in Canada, that's really rooted in structural and systemic racism. There's one for non-Indigenous people, and there's one for Indigenous people, and the quality and the quantity of service we receive does not meet the basic human rights standards.
It's believed 2 women are buried at a landfill under 40 feet of densely compacted waste. And keep in mind, it's December. The ground is frozen now in Winnipeg. Archaeological experts told Global News that it's on the high end of a complex landfill search, but it is doable. And families say it's the right thing to do to give the victims dignity and them closure. Donna.
All right, Melissa Ridgen in Winnipeg, thank you. Along the U.S.-Mexico border, thousands of people are trying to cross into the United States. As many as 10,000 people are believed to be making that crossing every day, and 2.4 million have already made the trek this year. More migrants are expected to attempt it when a Trump-era border restriction known as Title 42 expires on December 21st. Most of the people come from Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Mexico. And in Europe, thousands of people are risking their lives to cross the English Channel in small boats, hoping to start a new life in the UK. Early this morning, one of those boats capsized. A rescue mission involved a fishing boat, the Coast Guard, the Royal and French Navies, and police. Dozens of people were rescued from the frigid waters off the southeast coast of England, but at least 4 died. The English Channel between France and England is about 34 kilometers wide. It can be rough, and it's a route migrants have used in increasing numbers in recent years. As Crystal Gamansing reports, there's growing anger. The UK government has been turning a blind eye.
Yet another life lost, despite authorities knowing it would happen again. Crossing the English Channel is currently the only option for many desperate people. The dangerous journey to the UK often includes paying thousands of dollars to a smuggler or a spot on a dinghy like this one.
I'm sure the whole house will share my sorrow at the capsizing of a small boat in the channel in the early hours of this morning and the tragic loss of human life.
A fishing boat was the first to respond to a mayday call Wednesday. What followed was a multinational day-long search and recovery operation. 43 people, men, women, and children, were pulled alive from the sinking boat. It was one of a handful attempting the journey. To date, an estimated 45,000 have made that crossing, but it could reach 50,000 by the end of the year. Last year, following the deaths of 27 people in the channel, the government launched a crackdown. It said people would stop crossing if they knew they'd be turned away, and struck a deal to send people to Rwanda for processing and resettlement. That scheme is on hold following a European Court of Human Rights challenge.
It is not cruel or unkind to want to break the stranglehold of the criminal gangs who trade in human misery and who exploit our system and our laws.
A different tone from Suella Braverman, who at the end of October likened the landings on England's southern shore to an invasion, telling the Commons, let's stop pretending that they are all refugees in distress.
One of the main tragedies is, unfortunately, it will probably happen again unless the UK government changes its policies around migration.
Specifically, there are calls for an office on the French side of the channel so people can claim asylum, and for more resettlement programs similar to the one created for Ukrainians. Crystal Gamansing, Global News, London.
Canada is revoking the exemptions it made to sanctions, allowing a Montreal company to repair turbines for the Nord Stream 1 natural gas pipeline operated by the state-owned Russian company Gazprom. In July, Siemens Energy was granted an exemption to Canada's sanctions so it could have up to 6 turbines for the pipeline repaired at a Siemens facility in Montreal. Ottawa says the decision to revoke that temporary waiver was made because Russia failed to return the Nord Stream pipeline to full capacity once Canada agreed to return a turbine in July. At the time Canada issued the waiver, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky called the move absolutely unacceptable. A community in search of help coming up. Survivors of another hateful U.S. mass shooting press Congress to act now. Today marks 10 years since the world heard the name Sandy Hook Elementary. The mass shooting at that school in Newtown, Connecticut was horrifying. Today, flags were lowered in the community. People honored the victims by visiting a new permanent memorial that opened last month. 20 first-grade students were shot and killed, along with 6 adults. It was such a terrible, senseless crime. There was hope it would finally trigger Americans to recognize they need tighter gun control laws. But little has changed. Survivors of a more recent mass shooting at a Colorado nightclub were in Washington today. The LGBTQ2+ community has increasingly become targets of shootings, protests, and hateful rhetoric. And as Jackson Proskow reports, the fear is that even as the Biden administration takes steps to enshrine rights like same-sex marriage into law, it might not be enough to counter the rise in extremism.
I ran for my life that night and hid, praying and hoping the violence would end.
Less than a month after their safe space came under attack, survivors of the Club Q shooting brought their stories to Washington.
I fell over on the ground knowing I had been shot in my right arm.
The November massacre at the Colorado LGBTQ club left 5 dead and 18 wounded. An alleged hate crime at a time when LGBTQ Americans are under increasing threat.
We are being slaughtered and dehumanized across this country in communities you took oaths to protect.
Survivors point to a sharp rise in anti-gay and anti-transgender rhetoric that's become mainstream.
This is an effort to degrade the country, to make it into a joke.
From the most watched cable news channel,
the end goal is the normalization of pedophilia, right?
To the mouths of politicians.
They support sexualizing kids in kindergarten.
That is harmful. It's extremely harmful. And it is what spurred the attack at Club Q. I do blame the rise in hateful rhetoric, especially around trans individuals, especially around drag performers. They're not groomers. They're just people.
Increasingly, the LGBTQ2 community is under threat. Drag performances have faced protests and bomb threats. The worrying climate was recognized by President Joe Biden Tuesday as he signed federal protections for same-sex marriage.
Racism, anti-Semitism, homophobia, transphobia, they're all connected. But the antidote to hate is love.
Love may be protected in law. Survivors of the Club Q massacre fear it won't be enough to turn the rising tide of hate.
Hate speech turns into hate action, and actions based on hate almost took my life from me at 25 years old.
Jackson Proskow, Global News, Washington.
Funding-focused research ahead, the push for homegrown scientific innovation. From the space race to the race to create COVID-19 vaccines to yesterday's announcement about nuclear fusion, there is plenty of proof of just how effective so-called moonshot projects can be. Now, as David Aiken reports, there's a push for the Canadian government to dream and spend big.
One small step for man.
One of the original moonshot research programs was just that.
One giant leap for mankind.
Putting a human being on the moon. And this week, the latest payoff in moonshot research.
Well, this one, the nuclear fusion, I would call a sunshot because, of course, what powers the sun is nuclear fusion.
For decades, it's been the U.S. government that led the world in funding and focusing research moonshots.
If we want those kind of breakthroughs, and I think we do, for all kinds of reasons, government has to be there to fund the moonshots. The private sector won't.
Sometimes Canada helps with international moonshots. For example, some of the research that helped discover mRNA vaccines happened at Hamilton's McMaster University. But Canada's science policy has tended to be more risk-averse, incremental.
Good evening, colleagues.
But maybe no longer.
What kind of funding do we need?
Several weeks ago, MPs on the House of Commons Science Committee started putting together the framework for Canada's first ever moonshot research program.
I thought it was great.
I was very excited to hear that there was an interest for this kind of thing.
Experts say the key to a successful moonshot program is identifying the mission. Find a focus or two for Canadian research.
New technologies for fighting climate change, or to deal with pandemics and infectious diseases, or antimicrobial resistance, which are all areas where there is not enough research being done.
These are societal needs that we have identified as a society.
Canada's innovation minister is enthusiastic about the potential.
My message to everyone is I want to lead. I want us to be ambitious. I want us to seize the moment. So what are the elements? You know, funding is one. Then is the organization of research and science in Canada. And then third, I would say who and in which field can we partner internationally?
Now, if it happens, look for Ottawa to take its first steps towards moonshot research by the spring of next year. David Aiken, Global News, Ottawa.
In the House of Commons today, the Prime Minister led tributes to Winnipeg MP Jim Carr, who died Monday of blood cancer. Carr was respected by politicians of all stripes and continued his work as an MP until days before his death.
In October, he told me that he was stopping treatment. It was a private moment in his hometown. Jim knew it was for the best.
Trudeau said Carr embodied characteristics common in people from the prairies: clear-headedness, pragmatism, and dedication. Carr sought to work with people on all sides of the House and worked right until the end. He died days after his private member's bill, Building a Green Prairie Economy, passed in the House of Commons. From music to the military, next, why the world's biggest K-pop group is going on hiatus. You may not know much about K-pop, but if you do, you know all about BTS. The Korean pop music stars have smashed song records, stolen millions of hearts. Well, now the group is going on hiatus because its oldest member has a duty to fulfill. He has to serve in South Korea's military. Mike Jorlay looks at how die-hard fans and even the Korean economy are taking the news.
Inside one of these unmarked vans, Private Jin, the South Korean Army's latest recruit. Jin had hoped his arrival would be private. But when you're a member of the biggest K-pop group in the world and top streamer on Spotify, privacy is next to impossible. And BTS fans needed more than this social media post showing off his buzz cut. Cuter than expected, he wrote.
We are shocked so quickly and see his cut his hair yesterday and very, very sad. and finally realized this is real.
It's mandatory for all Korean men to serve 18 months in the military. Jin had been able to put off his service until he turned 30 in deference to the immense power of K-pop. And while granting him an exemption was fiercely debated, BTS ultimately decided all 7 members would serve.
One of the really interesting things about this particular situation is that since K-pop contributes such a tremendous amount of GDP to South Korea, you have to wonder what the economic effect of BTS disappearing for a number of years is going to be.
Perhaps the closest comparable is Elvis Presley, who was drafted in 1958 and served 2 years in Germany. Others, like Johnny Cash and Jimi Hendrix, enlisted before they were famous.
It'll be interesting to see if BTS can continue their success after they're reconstituted when everybody gets out of the army. Will they grow with their audience, age with their audience, become more mature, or will they be Peter Panish and stay a boy band forever?
BTS's rabid fans are known as the Army. They're passionate and loud, so perhaps real military service will be a welcome break for K-pop's biggest export. Mike Drolet, Global News, Toronto.
And that is Global National for this Wednesday. I'm Donna Friesen. Tonight's Your Canada is this festive cabin in Spruce Grove, Alberta. Beautiful. We'd love to see your festive Canada photos. Please email them to viewers@globalnational.com. Thanks for watching. Hope to see you here again tomorrow. Bye-bye.